The Autobiography of C.H. Spurgeon, Chapter 95. In the sunny South. I do not think any human being upon earth ever felt so much repose of soul and body as I do. Many years of toil are all rewarded by this blessed rest, which only seems too good to be true. I have no task work, and do more voluntarily as a recreation than I have often done of obligation. No idle tongues disturb me, or cares molest me. The burden is taken from the shoulder, and the bit from between the jaws. If anything can make me young and strong again, this will. It is rest of a sort which I never knew before in all its forms. For at other times, pain, or dullness, or too much company, has made it less enjoyable. I rest on the wing, as the swallow is said to do. C.H.S. in letter from Mentone, written in 1882, up in Dr. Bennett's garden, when Harold read me the following lines, I adopted them as my own. O days of heaven, and nights of equal praise, serene and peaceful as those heavenly days, when souls drawn upward in communion sweet, enjoy the stillness of some close retreat. Discourse as if released and safe at home, of dangers past and wonders yet to come, and spread the sacred treasures of the breast upon the lap of covenant rest. It would have been easy to fill a volume with the account of Mr. Spurgeon's experiences in the sunny South, but the many other interesting portions of his wondrously full life made it needful to condense into 2 chapters the record of about 20 annual visits to the Riviera. He was fully familiar with most of the favorite resorts on that part of the Mediterranean shore, and he occasionally made a short stay at one or other of them. But Mentone was the place he loved beyond all the rest. Sometimes after going elsewhere for a change of scene, a few days sufficed for the enjoyment of the beauties and charms of the new region, and then he would say, I think we will hasten on to Mentone. On settling down in his old quarters, he generally exclaimed, with a sigh of relief, Ah, now I feel at home. Mr. Spurgeon's first visit to the Riviera was made before the railway had been completed along the coast, and he used often to describe to his traveling companions in latter days the delights of driving from Marseilles to Geneva, and so being able to see under the most favorable conditions some of the loveliest views on the face of the earth. Oh, that journey! One incident occurred which was quite unique in the pastor's experience. While staying for a few days at Nice, he received a letter from the captain of the Alabama, an American man-of-war lying in the harbor of Villafranca, inviting him to pay a visit to the vessel. On accepting the invitation, a very pleasant time was spent on board, and then the captain asked Mr. Spurgeon to come another day and preach to his officers and men, and to those of a second man-of-war, which were stationed not far off. Though the preacher was out for a holiday, he gladly availed himself of the opportunity of conducting the service desired, and after it was over, he chatted for some time with a number of his sailor hearers. Among them he found one who, when a boy, had been in Newington Sunday School, and whose uncle was a member at the Tabernacle, and another who, as a lad, ran away from his home at Dulwich. Several different nationalities were represented, and a good many Roman Catholics were there, but all seemed exceedingly pleased to listen to the gospel message. And Mr. Spurgeon said that he did not know that he had ever enjoyed preaching more than he did on that occasion, and that he should ever afterwards reckon himself an honorary chaplain of the United States Navy. Tidings of the service at Villafranca probably reached other American vessels, for several years later, when the USS Triton, the flagship of the European squadron, was at Gravesend, the chaplain wrote to Mr. Spurgeon, Could it be possible for you, amidst your abundant labors, to come down some day and address our officers and men? It would be esteemed a great favor, and I know it would be the means of doing incalculable good. All through the cruise it has been my desire that the ship might go to some port in your vicinity, hoping thereby that you might oblige us with a visit. The pastor was unable to accept to the request so kindly conveyed, but he fully appreciated the honor, and perhaps all the more because he was never invited to preach on board a British man of war. One of the traveling companions on the first visit to the Riviera was the pastor's friend, deacon, and publisher, Mr. Joseph Passmore, and he was usually a member of the little company who gathered at Mentone year by year, though latterly his partner, Mr. James Alabaster, had the joy of taking his turn at holiday-making with the author, whose words he had so long published. In 1879, Mr. Harold went for the first time, and from that year until the never-to-be-forgotten last visit of 1891-92, he was only absent twice, when his services seemed more urgently required at home. The accompanying reproduction of a photograph taken in Mentone in 1880 accompanies the portrait of Mr. Spurgeon, Mr. Passmore, Mr. Harold, Old George, and Father Abraham, whom the pastor always called his Oxfordshire deacon. Besides Mr. Passmore, the tabernacle deacons who stayed at Mentone with Mr. Spurgeon were Mr. W. Higgs, Sr., Mr. T. Greenwood, Mr. C. F. Allison, Mr. W. Higgs, and Mr. F. Thompson. Mr. Spurgeon often quoted one of Father Abraham's sayings, "I don't believe any of the three men in Mentone have done as much work as we three have done today." The speaker's share of the work consisted in sitting quite still and reading the newspaper or one of the many interesting books, which always formed part of the pastor's traveling equipment. It has been already intimated that the season of rest was by no means a time of idleness. Some friends even hinted that there was too much labor and too little relaxation. The quotation at the beginning of the present chapter gives the chief worker's own view of the matter in 1882, and a few more extracts from his letters of the same period will furnish details of the manner in which some of his days of holiday were pleasantly and profitably spent. I went up to Mr. Bennett's garden at 11 o'clock and remained there alone with Harold till 3:30. He read to me, and then I dictated to him, changing to a talk, a walk, a pun, some fun, and then reading and speechifying again, the electric shorthand, bottling all up for the future use. I did enjoy it, though the minstrel blew savagely. We were in a corner of the Kiosque, out of all the wind and yet in the open air, with mountains and seas and garden all around. No one disturbed us. It was the beau ideal of an author's studio. Harold read to me yesterday the life of Cromwell, grand, soul-inspiring. How the man trusted in the Lord. How sweet is the life of faith, and how splendid are its triumphs. I would live equally above joys and sorrows, and find my all in the Lord himself. It came on to blow, so Harold and I resorted to Dr. Bennett's garden from 10 to 3, having a grand read all alone till about 2 o'clock, and then admitting the other friends to be silent disciples among us. I gathered sheaves of texts for sermons and a few subjects for articles, and had a very happy day. The wind blew in hurricanes, but we sat with a wall at our back, and the sun shining upon our faces. Trees were bending in the gale, and the swift ships were flying across the main. But we had a hiding place from the wind, and sat there with comfort. Mr. Spurgeon never saw cyclamen going anywhere without recalling an amusing incident that happened in Mr. Bennett's garden at the time when visitors were freely welcomed there in the morning. The pastor and his secretary had found a sheltered spot where they were completely hidden from view, and during one of the pauses in the reading or dictating, they were greatly interested in hearing a young lady, quite near them, exclaim in unmistakable transatlantic tones, "Oh, Mother, do come here. There are some lovely sickmen, just here. I do love sickly men." Perhaps the speaker would not have been quite so enthusiastic if she had been aware of the proximity of the English listeners, who mischievously gave to her words a meaning she never intended them to convey. When Dr. Bennett restored the Saracenic Tower, here represented, he placed it at the disposal of Mr. Spurgeon, who at once availed himself of such a delightful retreat, perched up so high above the sea. The view all around was indescribably lovely, while by turning the key in the lock, absolute immunity from intruders was secured, and as the result, some of the brightest of the articles in the Sword and the Trowel were here written or dictated, and some of the choicest sermons in the Metropolitan Tabernacle pulpit were here composed, at least in outline. Only a short distance away from his tower, and perched on the very edge of the cliff overhanging the sea, stands the Italian guardhouse, which Mr. Spurgeon had to pass every time he went to see his friend, Mr. Thomas Hanbury, at the Palazzo Oregano La Mortola. The pastor often told the story of an incident that happened within this building in the days when the PHYLLOXERA was committing such deadly havoc among the vines of France and Italy. The two countries tried to prevent its further spread by forbidding the transport of flowers, fruit, shrubs, etc., from one land to the other. It was a foolish and useless regulation, for the PHYLLOXERA was already in possession of both sides of the frontier, and it led to many amusing scenes. One day Mr. Spurgeon was going with a party of friends for a picnic, and among the articles under his charge were a couple of oranges. He understood sufficient Italian to comprehend that the fruit could not be allowed to pass, but his ready wit suggested the best way out of the difficulty. So he walked into the soldier's room, peeled the oranges, carefully placing all the peel into the fire, and ate them, to the great amusement of the defender of the crown rights of the King of Italy. As the story has been published in various papers and books, Mr. Spurgeon is represented as having stepped back 5 or 6 paces into France in order to defy the Italian guards, whereas at the time he was probably 100 or 200 yards beyond the boundaries of the Republic. Dr. Bennett's garden was not the only open-air study that Mr. Spurgeon had at Mentone. In the accompanying illustration, it is easy to pick out the line of cypresses running through the dense mass of olive trees at the back of the chalet, the Swiss villa where Queen Victoria stayed when at Mentone. That cypress walk led up to one of the numerous quiet nooks where the pastor and the secretary spent many a delightful day. They started from the hotel soon after the little company of friends who had gathered for morning prayer had dispersed, and if the weather was favorable for a long stay out of doors, they carried the materials for a light lunch with them, a waterproof rug to spread on the ground to ward off rheumatism, and some books, of course generally including a volume of Brooks or Manton or some other Puritan divine, with a biography or something that would make a variety in the reading. The reader had to pause every now and then to jot down texts that struck the attentive listener as being suggestive, or to preserve, by means of phonograph, any happy and helpful thoughts that might be of service in after days. Sometimes the dictation would only suffice for a paragraph or two, and then the reading would be resumed. On other occasions, the whole article for the magazine would be ready for transcription before the return journey to the hotel. A large part of the clue of the maze and several of the illustrations and meditations, or flowers from a Puritan garden, were thus written at another retired spot not far from the Cypress Walk. A good idea of the kind of place that was usually selected for this purpose can be conveyed by the view that one of the pastor's friends took for him and most appropriately called a pretty peep. Occasionally, a time devoted to reading in the open air was spent in one of the many lovely valleys by which Mentone is surrounded. Mr. Spurgeon never forgot one experience which he had in the portion of the Gorbio Valley, represented in this illustration on the opposite page, concerning which he wrote, "In this valley I have spent many a happy day, just climbing to any terrace I preferred and sat down to read. I once left Mentone on Psalms 119 by the roadside, and before the next morning it was returned to me. Here, too, on Christmas Day, 1879, I learned what it is to walk in the light. I had been ill with gout, and on recovering, arranged to drive up this valley as far as the road would serve, and then send away the carriage, walk further on, have our lunch, and in the afternoon walk gently back to the spot where we left the conveyance, the man having orders to be there again by 3. Alas, I had forgotten that as far as the upper portion of the valley is concerned, the sun was gone soon after 12. I found myself in the shade before lunch was over, and shade meant sharp frost, for wherever the sun had not shone, the earth was frozen hard as a rock. To be caught in this cold would mean a long illness for me. So leaning on the shoulder of my faithful secretary, I set forth to hobble down the valley. The sun shone on me, and I could just move fast enough to keep his bright disk above the top of the hill. He seemed to be rolling downward along the gradually descending ridge, like a great wheel of fire, and I, painfully and laboriously stumbling along, still remained in his light. Of course, it was not the time for our chieftain to be at the appointed spot, so with many a groan, I had to stagger on until a stray conveyance came in our direction, out of the sunlight, all in winter. In the sunlight alone is summer. Oh, that spiritually I could always walk in the light of God's countenance as that day I managed to keep in the sun's rays. Like Enoch, let me walk with God, and thus walk out my day, attended still with heavenly light upon the King's highway." The Gorbio Valley was one of the special haunts of the trapdoor spiders, until visitors so ruthlessly destroyed their wonderful underground homes. Concerning these and other curious creatures, the pastor wrote to Mrs. Spurgeon, "How I wish you could be here to see the spiders' trapdoors. There are thousands of them here, and the harvesting ants also. Though the wise men declared that Solomon was mistaken when he said they prepare their meat in the summer. I shall send you a book about them all." When the volume arrived, it proved to be Harvesting Ants and Trapdoor Spiders by J. Moggridge. It contained such a choice inscription that is here reproduced in facsimile. One of the charms of Mentone to Mr. Spurgeon was the fact that he could constantly see there illustrations of biblical scenes and manners and customs. He frequently said he had no desire to visit Palestine in its present forlorn condition, for he had before his eyes in the Riviera an almost exact representation of the Holy Land as it was in the days of our Lord. He was greatly interested in an article written by Dr. Hugh Macmillan upon the subject, in which that devoted student of nature traced many minute resemblances between the climate, the conformation of the country, the flora and the habits of the people of the south of France of today, and those of the east in the time when Jesus of Nazareth trod those holy fields. In several of his Sabbath afternoon communion addresses, the pastor allured to the many things that constantly reminded him of Emmanuel's land, while the olive trees were a never-failing source of interest and illustration. One of the works with which he had made very considerable progress was intended to be, if possible, an explanation of all the scriptural references to the olive. Mr. Spurgeon often remarked that there were many biblical allusions which could not be understood apart from their Oriental associations, and as an incident, he said that some people have failed altogether to catch the meaning of Isaiah chapter 57, verse 20. The wicked are like the troubled sea, when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up myrrh and dirt. Those who have affirmed that the sea never can rest have not seen the Mediterranean in its most placid mood, when for days or even weeks at a time there is scarcely a ripple upon its surface. During that calm period all sorts of refuge accumulate along the shores, and then, when the time of the tempest comes, anyone who walks by the side of the agitated waters can see that they do cast up myrrh and dirt. Usually, during the pastor's stay at Mentone, there was at least one great storm, either far out at sea or near at hand. In 1882, in one of his letters home, he wrote the following graphic description of the scene he had just witnessed. This afternoon I had been out to watch the sea. There was a storm last night, and the sea cannot forgive the rude winds. So it is avenging its wrongs upon the shore. The sun shone at 3 o'clock, and there was no wind here. But away over the waters hung an awful cloud, and to our left a rainbow adorned another foaming mass of blackness. Though much mud was underfoot, all the world turned out to watch the hungry billows rush upon the beach. In one place they rolled against the Esplanade, and then rose like the waterworks at Versailles, high into the air, over the walk, and across the road, making people run and dodge, and leaving thousands of pebbles on the pavement. In another place, the sea removed all the foreshorn, undermined the walls, carried them away, and then assailed the broad path, which it destroyed in mouthfuls, much as a rustic eats bread and butter. Here and there, it took away the curb. I saw some 12 feet of it go, and then it attacked the road. It was amusing to see the people move as a specially big wave dashed up. The lamp posts were going when it came in, and an erection of solid stone, used as the site of a pump, was on the move. Numbers of people were around this as I came in at sundown. It was undermined, and a chasm was open between it and the road. Men were getting up the gas pipes, or digging into the road to cut the gas off. I should not wonder if the road is partly gone by the morning. Though splashed with mud, I could not resist the delight of seeing the huge waves and the seabirds flashing among them like soft lightnings. The deep sigh, the stern howl, the solemn hush, the booming roar, and the hollow mutter of the ocean were terrible and grand to me. Then the rosy haze of the far ascending spray and the imperial purple and azure of the most distant part of the waters, together with the snow-white mans of certain breakers on a line of rock, made up a spectacle never to be forgotten. Far east, far away, in the east, I saw just a few yards of rainbow standing on the sea. It seemed like a pharos glimmering there, or a ship in gala array, dressed out with the flags of all nations. O my God, how glorious thou art! I love thee the better for being so great, so terrible, so good, so true. This God is our God, forever and ever. Another phenomenon was thus described in a letter of the same period. About 6 in the evening, we were all called out into the road to see a superb aurora borealis, a sight that is very rarely seen here. Natives say that it is 12 years since the last appearance, and that it means a cold winter, which will drive people to Mentone. Our mountains are to the north, and yet above the tops we saw the red glare of this wonderful visitation. "Castorilla is on fire," said an old lady, as if the conflagration of a million such hamlets could cause the faintest approximation to the aurora, which looked like the first sight of a world on fire, or the blaze of the day of doom. Mr. Spurgeon had been at Mentone so many years that he had watched its growth from little more than a village to a town of considerable size. He had so thoroughly explored it that he knew every nook and cranny, and there was not a walk or drive in the neighborhood with which he was not perfectly familiar. His articles in the Sword and the Trowel on the journey from Westwood to Mentone and the drives around his winter resort have been most useful to later travelers, and far more interesting than ordinary guidebooks. Many of the villas and hotels were associated with visits to invalids or other friends, and some were the scenes of noble incidents which could not easily be forgotten. At the Hotel d'Italie, the pastor called to see John Bright, who was just then in anything but a bright frame of mind. He was in a very uncomfortable room, and was full of complaints of the variations in temperatures in the sunlight and in the shade. His visitor tried to give him a description of Mentone, as he had known it for many years, but the great tribune of the people seemed only anxious to get away to more congenial quarters. The Earl of Shaftesbury was another of the notable Mentor visitors, whom the pastor tried to cheer when he was depressed about the state of religion and social affairs in England and on the continent. One morning, among the little company gathered for family prayer, Mr. T.A. Denny unexpectedly put in an appearance. In explanation of his sudden arrival, he said, "I felt down in the dumps, so I thought I would just run over to my friend Spurgeon for a few days, for it always does me good to see and hear him." His presence was equally welcome to the pastor, and they drove together to some of the most charming places in the district. The genteel Sir Wilfrid Lawson scarcely needed anyone to raise his spirits, for he was in one of the merriest moods when he and Mr. Spurgeon had the hotel door met there, and the half hour they had spent together was indeed a lively time. The Right Honorable G.J. Shaw, Lefevre, was another politician whom the pastor met at Mentone. The subject of the Home Rule was just then coming to the front, and the Liberal statement heard that day what Mr. Spurgeon thought of Mr. Gladstone's plans. The time came when the opinions then expressed privily were published broadcast throughout the United Kingdom, and materially contributed to the great leader's defeat. In the early years of visiting Mentone, the pastor stayed at the Hotel d'Angelais, and he used often to say that he never passed that spot without looking at a certain room, and thanking God for the merciful deliverance which he there experienced. One day he was lying in that room very ill, but he had insisted upon the friends who were with him going out for a little exercise. Scarcely had they left when a madman, who had eluded the vigilance of the keepers, rushed in and said, "I want you to save my soul." With great presence of mind, the dear sufferer bade the poor fellow kneel down at the side of the bed, and prayed for him as best he could under the circumstances. Mr. Spurgeon then told him to go away and return in half an hour. Providentially he obeyed, and as soon as he was gone, the doctor and servants were summoned. But they were not able to overtake the madman before he had stabbed someone in the street, and only a very few days later he met with a terribly tragic end. In the garden of the same hotel, the pastor once had an unusual and amusing experience. A poor organ grinder was working away at his instrument, but evidently was evoking more sound than sympathy. Mr. Spurgeon, moved with pity at his want of success, took his place and ground out the tunes, while the man busily occupied himself with picking up the coins thrown by the numerous company that soon gathered at the windows and on the balconies to see and hear Mr. Spurgeon play the organ. When he left off, other guests also had a turn at the machine, and although they were not so successful as the first amateur player had been, the organ man departed. He carried away a heavier purse and a happier heart than he usually took home. It was while staying at the Hotel de Angelis that the pastor adopted a very original method of indicating one of the two Christian ordinances which were always very dear to him. At a social gathering at which Mr. Spurgeon and a large number of friends were present, Mr. Edward Jenkins, M.P., the author of Ginx', Baby, persistently ridiculed believers' baptism. It was a matter of surprise to many that he did not at once get the answer that he might have been sure he would receive sooner or later. The party broke up, however, without anything having been said by the pastor upon the question. But it was arranged that the next day all of them should visit Ventimigilia. On reaching the cathedral, Mr. Spurgeon led the way to the baptisms in the crypt. And when all the company had gathered round the old man, who was explaining the object of interest, the pastor said to his anti-immersionist friend, Mr. Jenkins, "You understand Italian better than we do. Will you kindly interpret for us what the guide is saying?" Thus, fairly trapped, the assailant of the previous evening began. This is an ancient baptism. He says that in the early Christian church, baptism was always administered by immersion. The crypt at once rang with laughter, in which the interpreter joined as heartily as anyone, admitting that he had been as neatly sold as a man well could be. He was not the only one who learned that the combatant who crossed swords with our Mr. Greatheart might not find the conflict to his permanent advantage. Mr. Spurgeon was never able to accept the invitation of Mr. Hanbury, who wished him to stay at the Palazzo Areno, but on 2 occasions he was the guest for a week or two of Mrs. Dungeon at the Villa Las Correzzas. He had frequently spent a day there, or gone to a drawing-room meeting in aid of one or other the many religious and benevolent works in which the good lady was interested, or in the evening had met at her house a number of friends belonging to so many different denominations that it seemed like a gathering under the auspices of the Evangelical Alliance. On one of these occasions there were so many Church of England canons in the company that Mr. Spurgeon humorously said that they might form a part of artillery. After a season of general conversation, the whole company usually settled down to listen to the story of the Stockwell orphanage, or remarkable instances of answers to prayer, or a few words of loving gospel talk, closing with earnest supplication for a blessing to rest upon all present. When the weather permitted, Mrs. Dungeon liked to arrange for a picnic, at which other friends could have the opportunity of meeting her elder guests. She related to him with great glee the remark of a Mentonous woman concerning one of their outings. "I can't make out you English people at all. You have nice hotels and houses where you can have your meals in comfort, and yet you go and eat your dinner in a ditch." The ditch was, of course, a dry one, and usually an Olive Garden was the scene of the al fresco repast. A favorite resort for these picnic parties was spelled Beaullieu, rightly named, a beautiful place. The route to it led directly through Monte Carlo, and the pastor was always glad when that part of the road was passed. He said that the whole region seemed to smell of brimstone. On one of his early visits to the Riviera, he had gone in to see the gamblers in the casino, but in all later years He avoided even the gardens surrounding the buildings, where so many had been ruined both for time and eternity. And he did not like any of those who were staying with him to go merely to look at the players. He used to tell them what was said once to a friend of his who was walking in the garden, and who, when he met the manager, began to apologize for his presence there, as he never went to the tables. "My dear sir," replied Monsignor, "you are heartily welcome to come at any time, even though you do not play. You are one of our best friends, for you and others like you help to make our place respectable." As the one to whom these words were addressed had an utter horror of supporting gambling in any way, he took care never again to be seen anywhere near the gardens. Almost every year, while Mr. Spurgeon was at Mentone, he heard of many cases of suicide as a result of gambling at Monte Carlo, and in various ways he discovered that the ruin wrought by the casino was far greater than was known to the public in England. On various occasions he published some of this information in the hope of aiding the movement for the abolition of the evil. One of those papers, entitled "The Serpents in Paradise," was reprinted and had a large circulation, but alas, the gambling still continues, and the annual roll of victims appears to be as long and as terrible as ever. One delightful excursion was arranged to Lagueto, the charming valley which has been at times the resort of almost numerous pilgrims who have gone there to obtain the supposed meditation of the large wax doll, which probably is still preserved in the chapel attached to the monastery. A drive out to that lovely spot, with a midday rest for the horses and an open-air meal for the travelers, was always regarded by Mr. Spurgeon as one of the greatest enjoyments of his sojourn in the sunny South. But it was only possible in the finest weather, and when the days were long enough to permit the return journey to be completed before sunset. Otherwise, a chill and painful illness would most likely follow, as there was so great a fall in the temperature the instant the sun disappeared for the night. End of chapter 95.